What if I told you that ancient Chinese farmers, merchants, and home cooks solved almost every single food storage problem we still face today? And they did it without refrigerators, without electricity, and without any modern technology whatsoever. Some of these methods are over 3,000 years old, and food scientists have actually gone back and studied them, only to discover that they work for very specific, very elegant chemical and biological reasons. We are counting down 25 of the most clever, most practical, and most fascinating ancient Chinese food preservation methods that genuinely still work today. And I promise you, by the time we get to number 1, you will never look at your kitchen the same way again. Stick with me all the way through because the top 5 especially are things almost nobody in the Western world knows about, and they will genuinely change how you store food at home. Number 25. Storing eggs in rice bran. In rural China, particularly in Zhejiang and Hunan provinces, households would bury fresh eggs completely inside dry rice bran, the outer husks that come off rice during milling. To do this yourself, take a clay pot or wooden box, pour a thick layer of rice bran on the bottom, place your eggs so they are not touching each other, and then completely cover them with more bran. The reason this works is surprisingly scientific. Rice bran creates a low humidity, slightly oxygen-reduced microenvironment around the egg. The porous shell of an egg needs to breathe, but too much oxygen exchange accelerates spoilage. The bran slows that exchange down just enough while also absorbing excess moisture that would otherwise allow bacteria to colonize the shell surface. Eggs stored this way in a cool, dark location can last several months without refrigeration. Number 24. Sealing fresh tofu in salted brine. Chinese families have been making fresh tofu for over 2,000 years, and they learned quickly that fresh tofu left in plain water goes slimy within a day or two. The solution was a light salted brine, roughly 1 tablespoon of salt dissolved per liter of water. Submerge your fresh tofu completely, store it in a sealed ceramic container, and change the brine every 2 to 3 days. The salt creates an osmotic environment hostile to the bacteria responsible for spoilage, while the water itself keeps the tofu from drying out and crumbling. Salt concentration matters here because too much will actually draw moisture out of the tofu and ruin the texture. The light brine is the sweet spot that preserves without destroying. Number 23. Drying and smoking river fish over pine wood. Along the Yangtze River and Pearl River regions, fishermen developed a 2-stage preservation method that combined partial drying with aromatic smoke from pine, cypress, or tea wood. Clean the fish, rub the flesh with a dry mixture of salt and Sichuan pepper, let it rest overnight, then hang it over a low, slow-burning fire for several hours. The salt draws moisture from the flesh, the heat continues drying, and the smoke deposits phenolic compounds onto the surface of the fish that are genuinely antimicrobial. These phenols create a chemical barrier that mold and bacteria cannot easily penetrate. The reason pine or tea wood was specifically chosen is that both produce particularly phenol-rich smoke, which is why smoked meats in general have such dramatically extended shelf lives. Number 22. Preserving vegetables in fermented rice water. This one surprises most people. When rice is washed before cooking, that cloudy water is loaded with starches and beneficial microorganisms. In southern China, families would collect this water, allow it to sit for 1 to 2 days until slightly sour, and then use it as a quick fermentation brine for leafy greens and cucumber. Pack your vegetables tightly into a ceramic jar, pour the slightly fermented rice water over them, seal loosely with a cloth, and leave at room temperature for 2 to 4 days. The naturally occurring lactobacillus bacteria in the rice water begin fermenting the sugars, producing lactic acid, which rapidly drops the pH and creates an acidic environment where harmful bacteria simply cannot survive. This is essentially the same science behind commercial lacto-fermentation. Number 21. Burying salted duck eggs in ash and clay. This is a classic technique still practiced in Guangdong and Fujian today. Mix wood ash, red clay, and coarse salt into a thick paste using a small amount of water. Coat each raw duck egg completely in this mixture until it has a shell of roughly half a centimeter thick. Let them sit for 30 to 40 days. The alkaline ash slowly penetrates the eggshell, changing the internal chemistry of the egg, firming the white into a jelly-like texture and transforming the yolk into a rich, creamy, slightly gritty center that is deeply savory. The alkaline environment destroys the bacteria that would otherwise decompose the egg while simultaneously triggering protein denaturation. This is how traditional century eggs and salted ash eggs are made, and the chemistry is genuinely elegant. Number 20. Storing garlic braided and air-dried in ventilated shade. Garlic has been cultivated in China for over 3,000 years, and Chinese farmers discovered that the absolute worst thing you can do with garlic after harvest is seal it in a damp container. Instead, they braided garlic bulbs together by their stalks and hung them in areas with steady airflow but no direct sunlight, typically under roof overhangs. The continued drying of the outer papery layers concentrates the allicin compounds that already make garlic naturally antimicrobial. The braiding technique is important because it keeps individual bulbs separated, preventing the trapped humidity between touching surfaces that leads to mold. Air circulation removes the small amounts of moisture the bulbs continue to release post-harvest. Done correctly, garlic stored this way lasts 6 to 9 months. Number 19. Making mei kai, or dried preserved mustard greens. This fermentation and drying combination from Shaoxing in Zhejiang province produces mustard greens that are genuinely shelf-stable for over a year. Wash and wilt fresh mustard greens in the sun for 1 to 2 days until they are soft and slightly yellowed. Then pack them tightly into a salted layer in an earthenware jar, pressing out air, and let them ferment under weight for several weeks. After fermentation, spread them out and sun-dry them completely until they are dark brown and leathery. The two-stage process is important. Fermentation converts sugars and produces lactic acid while also breaking down harsh compounds in the mustard. The subsequent thorough drying removes the residual moisture that bacteria and mold need to survive. The result is a deeply umami, intensely flavored ingredient that stores almost indefinitely in a sealed container. Number 18. Preserving pork in rice wine lees. After making rice wine or Shaoxing wine, the fermented solids left behind are called wine lees or juzao. These are not waste. Pack cuts of pork, chicken, or even shrimp tightly into containers surrounded by wine lees, add salt, and seal. The alcohol remaining in the lees is a direct antimicrobial agent. The organic acids in the fermented solids lower pH, and the complex enzyme activity actually continues to break down proteins gently, creating a more tender, deeply flavored product over time. This is why Zhao Ru, wine lees preserved pork, has a flavor profile completely different from simply salted pork. The lees actively transform the meat while simultaneously preserving it. Leave it for anywhere from 2 weeks to several months, depending on your desired intensity. Number 17. Drying tofu until completely hard. Fresh tofu is water-heavy and perishable, but ancient Chinese cooks discovered that if you removed virtually all the moisture, you created something entirely different. Slice pressed tofu into thin pieces, rub with salt and 5-spice powder, and dry in direct sunlight for several days or over very low heat for many hours until the tofu becomes rock hard and dark. This dried tofu, called dugan in its many varieties, has had its water activity reduced far below the threshold where bacteria and mold can grow. In this form, it is shelf-stable for weeks at room temperature and months if sealed from humidity. When you rehydrate it in cooking, it absorbs flavors beautifully because the cellular structure has been physically compressed and then opens back up when moisture is reintroduced. Number 16. Storing fresh ginger in damp sand. This technique comes from rural Shandong and Fujian, where ginger is a critical crop. Dig a shallow pit or use a wooden box. Place a layer of slightly damp clean sand on the bottom, not wet sand, just barely moist. Bury your fresh ginger rhizomes completely in the sand and store in a cool location. Ginger is a living rhizome that continues to respire after harvest. The slightly moist sand maintains just enough humidity to prevent the rhizome from shriveling and desiccating, while also being dry enough that the surface does not stay wet enough for mold to colonize it. The sand also insulates the ginger from temperature fluctuations. Chinese farmers doing this would check and mist the sand periodically. Fresh ginger stored this way stays firm and juicy for 3 to 6 months. Number 15. Making Jia Kai, Sichuan pickled mustard stem. This is one of the most regionally specific preservation techniques on this list. Peel and slice the swollen stems of a particular variety of mustard plant, rub them aggressively with salt, and place them under heavy weights to expel their liquid over 24 hours. Rinse, then massage with a paste of chili powder, Sichuan pepper, and salt. Pack into sealed ceramic jars and ferment for weeks to months. The pressing stage is critical because it collapses the cell walls and forces out the bitter glucose inolate compounds that would make the final product unpleasant. The subsequent fermentation with the spice paste produces lactic acid, while the chili and Sichuan pepper contribute their own antimicrobial capsaicinoids and aromatic compounds. The result is a shelf-stable, intensely flavored condiment that actually improves in complexity for up to a year. Number 14. Preserving plums as suanmei, sour plum, using salt and sun. When green plums are still firm and unripe, Chinese preservers would coat them heavily in salt and spread them on bamboo mats in full direct sunlight for multiple days, bringing them in at night. The salt draws moisture out of the plum flesh osmotically, concentrating the organic acids naturally present in the fruit, particularly citric and malic acid. This rapid acidification of the flesh surface, combined with the extreme reduction in water content, creates conditions hostile to microbial growth. The sun-drying also triggers Maillard-adjacent browning reactions that contribute to the characteristic deep flavor. Suanmei preserved this way can last for years, and the high acid concentration effectively continues to suppress any microbial activity even during long-term storage. Number 13. Fermenting black beans with salt and thyme. Dushi, or fermented black soybeans, come from a preservation tradition dating back to the Han Dynasty. Cover dry black soybeans in water overnight, cook until soft, then spread them out and allow them to spontaneously develop mold over several days in a warm environment. Once a white mold bloom appears, mix the beans aggressively with salt and spices including ginger, chili, and orange peel depending on the regional variation. Pack into sealed containers and age for weeks or months. The initial mold phase develops enzymes, particularly proteases, that begin breaking down the dense soybean proteins. The subsequent salt and aging phase then harnesses those enzymes to create extraordinarily complex umami flavors, while the salt concentration suppresses any dangerous pathogens. This is enzyme-assisted fermentation combined with salt preservation working together. Number 12. Storing chestnuts in cool soil. In Hebei and Shandong, chestnut farmers learned that freshly harvested chestnuts need to be kept alive but dormant. Chestnuts, unlike most nuts, have high moisture content and are more like a starchy vegetable than a dry nut. They mold quickly if stored in open air. The solution was to mix chestnuts with slightly damp clean soil or sand in a ratio of roughly equal parts, store in a cool cellar or buried pit, and allow them to enter a natural dormancy state. The cool temperature slows their respiration almost to a halt, while the slightly moist medium prevents desiccation. The soil particles also physically separate the chestnuts from each other, preventing any mold from spreading between them. Chestnuts stored this way remain sweet and fresh tasting through an entire winter season. Number 11. Air drying lotus root in ventilated shade. Lotus root is used in Chinese cooking from Hubei to Guangdong, and it poses a preservation challenge because of its high starch and moisture content. Chinese cooks discovered that by first slicing lotus root thinly, blanching briefly in slightly salted water, and then drying in the shade with good airflow, rather than in direct harsh sunlight, the starch structure could be preserved without turning brittle or losing the characteristic crunch when rehydrated. Direct sunlight dries too fast and damages the cellular structure. Shade drying with good ventilation removes moisture slowly, allowing the starch granules to stabilize gradually. The brief blanching step also inactivates the enzymes within the lotus root that would otherwise cause browning and textural breakdown during drying. Number 10. Making jiang, fermented soybean paste. This is arguably the most important fermentation tradition in Chinese food history, predating written records. Cook soybeans until very soft, mash into a paste, shape into bricks, and allow natural mold to colonize the surface over 10 to 20 days in a warm, humid environment. Crumble the molded bricks into salt and water. Pour into large ceramic urns and allow to ferment and age under sunlight for months, stirring regularly. The mold colonies develop the full enzyme suite needed to break down proteins and starches into amino acids and simple sugars. The long open-air fermentation under sunlight pasteurizes the surface repeatedly, while the interior continues developing complexity. The salt provides the preservation framework that allows this process to happen safely. The result is shelf-stable for years. Number 9. Smoking and drying lapcheong, Chinese sausage. The Cantonese tradition of lapcheong involves mincing pork with high fat content, seasoning it with soy sauce, rose wine, sugar, and salt, stuffing it into natural casings, tying it into links, and then hanging it in the open winter air or over smoke to dry for 2 to 4 weeks. The combination of salt, the alcohol from rose wine, sugar as a preservative in high concentration, drying, and smoke creates multiple overlapping preservation layers. Each mechanism addresses different spoilage pathways. The alcohol and salt suppress bacteria, drying reduces water activity, smoke adds phenolic antimicrobial compounds, and the high fat content, once oxidized slightly on the surface, actually forms a protective waxy barrier. Lapcheong stored in a cool, dry place lasts for months. Number 8. Preserving fish in rice, narazushi origin. Before vinegar-dressed sushi existed, Chinese preservation along the Yunnan and Guangxi corridor involved packing cleaned fish in cooked rice and salt in sealed containers for months to years. The fish and rice ferment together, the rice starch fermenting into acids that preserve the fish flesh deep in its protein matrix. This technique migrated into early Japanese food culture and became the precursor to modern sushi. To do this, salt the fish heavily for 24 hours, rinse, pack in alternating layers of cooked cooled rice and fish, press under weight, seal, and wait. After 3 to 6 months, the fish develops an intense fermented flavor while remaining safe to eat due to the dramatically lowered pH throughout. Number 7. Storing winter vegetables in an underground cellar with ventilation holes. This is structural preservation rather than chemical, but no less clever. Northern Chinese farm families would dig cellars 2 to 3 meters deep, line them with packed earth, and create small ventilation channels at specific angles that allowed cold air to circulate down in winter while preventing the kind of stagnant cold that freezes vegetables. Root vegetables, cabbages, and turnips stored inside would sit at a stable temperature just above freezing throughout winter. The physics of the angled ventilation channels is important because it allows heavier cold air to flow in and warmer stale air to escape upward without creating temperature swings. This passive cooling system required no energy and maintained near-perfect storage conditions for months. Number 6. Drying shiitake mushrooms in sunlight. This is one of the oldest preservation techniques in Chinese food culture, referenced in texts over 1,000 years old. Fresh shiitake mushrooms are laid gill-side up on bamboo racks in direct sunlight for 2 to 3 full days. The drying reduces water content to below 10%, making microbial growth impossible. But the real discovery here is that sunlight exposure dramatically increases the vitamin D content of shiitake through ultraviolet conversion of ergosterol. Ancient Chinese cooks did not know this biochemistry, but they did observe that sun-dried shiitake had superior flavor compared to shade-dried ones. The heat and UV light also trigger enzymatic reactions that concentrate guanylate, the specific umami compound in dried shiitake, making them taste more intensely mushroom-like than fresh ones. Number 5. Huangju wine preservation of meat. Zhejiang province has a tradition of cooking partially raw meat briefly and then submerging it completely in shaoxing rice wine in sealed clay jars. The alcohol content of traditional shaoxing wine, between 14 and 18%, is high enough to halt microbial activity entirely at those concentrations. The wine's complex amino acids and organic acids continue to penetrate and transform the meat's flavor during storage. Meats preserved this way were considered luxury items precisely because the flavor development over months of wine immersion created something far superior to simply fresh cooked meat. The seal is critical. If oxygen gets in, the alcohol oxidizes and the preservation fails. Wax-sealed clay jars were the traditional solution. Number 4. Making fu-ru, fermented bean curd. Fresh tofu cubes are inoculated with specific mold species by placing them in warm, humid conditions on beds of rice straw for 3 to 5 days until covered in white fuzzy mold. They are then packed into jars with salt, rice wine, chili, and spices, completely submerged and sealed for weeks to months. The mold's proteolytic enzymes continue working even inside the jar, breaking down tofu proteins into silky, creamy, intensely flavored paste. The salt, wine, and seal prevent any dangerous organisms from entering once the mold phase is complete. The result is a deeply savory condiment often called Chinese cheese, because the biochemical process genuinely parallels aged cheese production in terms of enzyme-driven protein breakdown, creating flavor complexity from a relatively bland starting ingredient. Number 3. Preserving lemons and citrus in salt. In southern China and among overseas Chinese communities, whole lemons or small limes are packed tightly into clay jars with enormous quantities of salt, sealed and stored for anywhere from 1 year to over a decade. The salt draws moisture out of the fruit osmotically over many months. The rind softens and darkens, and the whole fruit transforms into an intensely concentrated, deeply complex, salty, sour, bitter preserving medium. The organic acids in the citrus combine with the salt to create a pH and osmotic environment where nothing pathogenic can survive. Very old preserved lemons from this tradition are considered medicinal, as well as culinary, used in teas and broth for sore throats. The longer they age, the more complex the flavor profile becomes. Number 2. Making laba garlic with vinegar. During the Laba festival around the winter solstice, families across northern China would peel fresh garlic cloves and submerge them completely in rice vinegar in sealed glass or ceramic containers. Within about 2 weeks, the garlic turns a vivid emerald green, a transformation caused by the acidic environment reacting with the sulfur compounds and pigment precursors in the garlic. The vinegar's acetic acid completely suppresses microbial activity, and the garlic cloves remain perfectly preserved for months. The garlic mellows considerably in flavor, losing the harsh raw burn and developing a crisp, pleasantly tart, complex taste. The green color is completely natural and comes from the same chemistry that makes some garlic turn green during cooking when acidic ingredients are involved. And now we have arrived at number 1, the most ingenious, most scientifically elegant ancient Chinese food preservation method, one that produced an entirely new category of food that changed Chinese cuisine forever. 1,000-year egg pie dan alkaline mineral clay transformation. Raw duck or chicken eggs are coated in a mixture of quicklime, wood ash, salt, clay, and traditionally rice husks, then sealed and left undisturbed for anywhere from 2 weeks to 3 months depending on the recipe. The quicklime releases hydroxide ions that gradually penetrate the porous eggshell and raise the internal pH of the egg dramatically, sometimes above pH 12. This extremely alkaline environment triggers protein denaturation without heat, turning the white into a translucent, dark, firm jelly and the yolk into a creamy, gray-green, intensely savory sphere. The alkalinity destroys every pathogen possible while simultaneously cooking the egg through pure chemistry. No fire, no heat. Just chemistry, time, and mineral knowledge developed over centuries of observation. This is not just food preservation, this is food transformation at a molecular level, and ancient Chinese cooks discovered it through patient experimentation long before anyone understood what a pH level even was. That is the genius of this entire tradition. These were not accidents, they were solutions, each one carefully refined over generations until it worked perfectly, and the fact that they still work today is proof that real understanding does not need a laboratory to be valid. If you want to see the 25 most interesting ancient Chinese fermentation recipes using these exact methods, that video is right there. And if any of these methods genuinely surprised you, drop the number in the comments. I read every single one.